Okay, in this last section of 3 or 4 videos, we're going to be looking at 3 main things. I'm going to quickly just touch on immigration and some tricks to use when linking immigration to our aggregate supply potential or productive capacity or strong and sustainable growth. We're going to talk about the difference between market versus interventionist aggregate supply policies. So when the government allows the market to determine how goods are allocated and how that can boost aggregate supply, as opposed to when the government intervenes. And then looking at some of the strengths and weaknesses of aggregate supply policies. So starting off just with immigration, okay, when you're linking immigration to economic growth, there's some key things that you want to be able to touch on in terms of being able to effectively answer the question and draw on a range of things when linking it to this goal. So first thing is the increase of the supply of labour, and you need to make mention of the fact that that leads to increased, downward pressure on wages, which helps to increase employment and helps to increase output. So basically we're increasing the quantity of labour available to the market, or the quantity of resources, which in itself allows us to produce a greater volume of goods and services, partly because it reduces pressure on wages. It also helps to reduce capacity constraints, or in other words to say that is skill shortages, which again is helped to reducing wage pressures, but also helps to boost labour productivity because we get access to the best skills from around the world. So that's when you can touch on, being able to take advantage of world's best practice, being able to take advantage of knowledge that they have about the best ways to produce goods and services, or better production techniques. It enhances productivity because we get access to the best skills from those around the world. Okay, it also allows us to achieve economies of scale. A really key thing you want to talk about that will separate your answer from the pack is this ability for firms to then be able to produce on a bigger scale because of the increase in the population and the size of the labour force, and that will allow them to produce with lower fixed costs per unit of output because of that increased level of a higher population, higher level of output. And last thing is that by increasing immigration, it should be able to increase our connectedness to overseas markets. So what do we mean by that is that they may have knowledge of world markets, best what other industries or what people overseas are interested in, what types of products, what types of design, and that should help to facilitate export demand. So within your answer, you've talked about the impact on wages, you've talked about the quantity of labour, you've talked about that helps to alleviate capacity constraints or skill shortages, which helps to lower wage costs and boost productivity. You've talked about the skills they bring to the workforce, linking in things like world's best practice. When you're talking about that and innovative new ideas, you can talk about economies of scale as well as our connectedness to world markets. So this question here is, explain how immigration policy might operate to raise Australia's productive capacity, and in doing so help improve strong and sustainable growth and living standards. A lot in this question potentially could be a 6-mark question. You'd want to define productive capacity at the start of your answer. You'd want to define strong and sustainable economic growth. And clearly you're going to finish your answer with some links to how immigration helps to improve living standards. You could talk about negatives, but the focus of your answer should be on the positives. You need to answer all parts of the question. So you need to talk about how it boosts productive capacity, and you need to talk about how it increases economic growth. So when you're talking about productive capacity, okay, remember that's all about maximising our total level of output when all our resources are used to their full potential. Okay, now if we've got more labour, then we've clearly got more potential, and therefore our productive capacity has increased. So when you're talking about our productive capacity, first thing you might talk about the fact that we have an ageing population, and then use the immigration, explain how that helps to solve an ageing population or prevent the problems with an ageing population. So that may be through increased, more taxpayers, so there's less pressure on taxpayers. It's through reducing skill shortages, increasing the quantity of labour. Then you want to talk about the details of immigration policy. So again, it's mentioning immigration policy in your answer. So within that, you want to focus on the fact that most of our immigration has been skilled migration, that they focused on areas, young people to work in areas where we have specific skill shortages, and around 68% of that is skilled migration. So talk about the fact, define the goal of strong and sustainable growth, explain what our current immigration policy is, and then start linking it to productive capacity and strong and sustainable economic growth. Define the goals briefly, and then link, when you're talking about productive capacity, you can focus on alleviating skill shortages, you can focus on giving us access to better skilled labour, and that allows us to produce a greater volume of goods and services because they bring innovative ideas for production. You can talk about reducing wage pressures, which makes firms more willing to supply because it lowers production costs. And then when you're linking it to strong and sustainable growth, You can talk about the fact that it keeps inflation down, because that's part of the goal. It allows us to boost our output, should create employment in the long term as we become more internationally competitive, and therefore allows us to achieve stronger growth without inflationary pressures. And then at the end of your answer, you would focus on living standards, and you would focus on the fact that it should lead to potentially lower prices, which helps to boost our purchasing power. You can talk about the fact that it leads to potentially more jobs because of our increased international competitiveness, with boost our living standards. And then you could touch on the fact that some people may experience higher unemployment as there's lack of incentive to train up skilled workers in Australia, and that could be one negative for our living standards. We'll talk about market versus government intervention as policies in the next video.